Good evening. I would like to welcome you to tonight's 7th educational webinar sponsored by the Coalition Peace Initiative and co-sponsored by 11 other organizations, as we shown you in the slide earlier. My name is Don Tao, and I will serve as your host for tonight's program. Tonight's program is on U.S.-China relationship, 19th century. As you know, we are organizing a series of 9 webinars to promote peace between U.S. and China. The series of webinars all revolve around the 3 topics of Chinese-American experience in the United States, modern Chinese history, U.S.-China relationship. The reason is because the most important question facing the world today is whether our world is moving toward peace or moving toward war. And the key to answering that question is the relationship between the United States and China. In the previous 6 webinars, we have covered the first 2 topics of Chinese-American experience in the United States, U.S.-China relationship. Tonight, we will discuss the relationship in the 19th century. Next week, we will discuss that relationship in the 20th and 21st centuries. We hope that these educational webinars will help people understand that the current U.S. policy of demonization of China is not based on facts, but based on fabrications. And that such fabricated demonization of China is not good for Americans and also not good for all the people of the world, because it'll move the world toward war instead of peace. The consequence would be that critical funding will be allocated to the military and for wars, instead of using those valuable resources to improve our economy. We'll build our crumbling infrastructure to work on global problems like climate change, pandemic, terrorism, poverty, illiteracy, discrimination, and promote peace. We hope that you'll join with these peace-promoting organizations like our co-sponsors to help move the world toward peace. Thank you. Now we will start tonight's program. I'll serve your moderator. I'm happy to announce that our speaker, Dr. George Koo, is one of the most qualified speakers on this topic. Now I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. George Koo. George is an international business advisor. He was the founder of International Strategic Alliances, a cross-border advisory firm to assist U.S. high-tech companies in Asia. He was a senior advisor in the Chinese service company until he retired from Duluth in 2008 and served on the board of directors of Las Vegas Sands from 2008 to June 2014. In 2018, he joined the board of Fresh Chills, a startup offering green energy building platforms. He assisted American companies to establish business alliances in China since 1978. And he served as a board of director or board advisor to Dongfang Fuji Thompson, a rare Sino-Japanese American joint venture in automotive components from 1985 to 2010. He served on the board of New American Media, a nonprofit ethnic media organization from 1997 until he ceased operation in 2018. He's a founder and chairman of the board of the Burlingame Foundation in 2017. He's a regular contributor to Online Asia Times and writes on issues related to Chinese Americans and U.S.-China relationships. The accumulation of his writings can be found on www.georgekoo.com. He has appeared in mainstream and ethnic media in print, radio, and TV related to those subject areas. George received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in Chemical Engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and his Doctor of Science from Stevens Institute of Technology and an MBA from Santa Clara University. I'm looking forward to hear what Dr. Koo has to say tonight and also next week for this most important session. George, the floor is yours.
Very much, Don. Good evening, everybody, and I thank Don for organizing and inviting me. It's my honor to be part of this series of webinar, and I want to thank all the sponsoring organizations for doing this. This is a very important subject. The future of our children and grandchildren will depend on how U.S. and China act towards each other. And hopefully, there's going to be a future for them. So can we go to the PowerPoint presentation, Don, please?
Okay.
So my talk has 3 sections. The first section is going to be on the early relationship between America before even it was a country, when it was still colonies, and China. And that's primarily based on this book, Fateful Ties, written by Gordon Chang. And I must clarify that this Gordon Chang has real credentials. He's a history professor as well as a vice provost at Stanford University, not to be confused with the other Gordon Chang that I call the collapse Chang, who predicted the collapse of China for 20 years now. His book came out 20 years ago. I will talk more about him next week. The second part of my talk is about the unique role Anson Burlingame played in the U.S.-China relations. And primarily the materials that you'll see there is on that second link. It's called burlingame.cmain.org. That has a vast collection of information and archive. When I was on the board of Las Vegas Sands, I convinced the president and COO to commission a research on the life of Anson Burlingame. And Violet Fun, who was available at the time, took on the task. Now, she was the researcher for the Oscar-winning documentary Rape in Nanjing, based on Iris Chang's book. And she did a wonderful job searching the archives in the US as well as in Beijing among the files of Gongqing Wang, Prince Gong, the regent, during the Manchu period. The only real part of the search that's missing was the archives in Taiwan, in Taipei. Then the rest of it, all the links, has to do with the third part of my talk, which I will defer until we get there. So let's go to the next slide. So most of you, I'm sure, know all about the Boston Tea Party. I wonder how many of you know that the tea the colonials threw into the Boston Harbor was from China. As a matter of fact, a good part of that tea was from Wuyi Shan, which is Wuyi Mountain in Fujian province. And I have a personal connection because I not only have been to Wuyi Mountain, the tea that Wuyi Mountain produces, called Tie Guanyin or Iron Goddess, is my favorite tea. And incidentally, favorite for Chiang Kai-shek as well. Now, the tea that the British controlled was probably a very dark roast tea from China. And the unrest for the colonial party was because not only did the British control the sale of tea and the export to the colonies, but they levied a very high unfair tariff on the tea. And this is the cause of one major cause of discontent. So after the Americans gained their independence, virtually one of the first things they did was to send the Empress of China as the first American ship to go to China to start China trade. Now, I have to apologize. My assistant, who shall go nameless, in helping me with the graphics of this PowerPoint, used a slide that's not appropriate. The Empress of China was clipper ship, sails on sails, no steam engine at that time. But the ship had the approval of President Washington. It was financed by Robert Morris, one of the, I think probably the wealthiest man in colonial America at the time. And a crew of 34 took 6 months to sail from the East Coast around the Cape of Cape Horn and Cape of Good Hope around Africa and got to Guangzhou. And they shipped fur as well as 30 tons of ginseng that grew in Northeast America. It took 6 months to get there, and of course it took 6 more months to come back. Within 10 years, there were 70 ships from America plying the China trade. And you can see between 1784, when the Empress of China set sail, to 1814, there were 618 American ships that went to Guangzhou and Macau. And thereby, the U.S. became the second largest trading nation with China, next to Great Britain. By 1850, American was importing 30,000 tons of tea per year. The wealthiest blue bloods in America, in Boston and elsewhere, they made their money trading with China. The American dream, frankly, was to do business with China, because that road lies the riches. In the textbooks, we talk about the American pioneers going west for homestead, but actually among the elites of America, the American dream was to do business with China. The vision prompted Thomas Jefferson to make that Louisiana purchase, because the motivation and drive was to find a closer, shorter route to China. And they firmly believed at the time that if they get to the West Coast, they will find a harbor that will get closer to China. As a matter of fact, the Lewis and Clark expedition was trying to find the quickest way to the West Coast. So just to put things in perspective, there's about, at the time of the forming of the United States of America, the population was about 4 million. The Chinese population was 400 million. And obviously the Americans looked at China as a major nation of wealth and technology. In fact, Benjamin Franklin said that we have to learn from China because they have the leading technology. Next slide, please. The American traders found that ginseng was not a very welcome item, because the Chinese prefer the ginseng in Korea. And by the way, from the last slide, I forgot to mention, when Bob Morris organized that trip to China, he expected to make a 600% profit. The actual profit from that first sale was only 25%, but that was enough to motivate the increase in sales. So very quickly, the Americans were decimating the sea otter on the West Coast from Oregon, Washington, and California. So that by 1930, the sea otter on the West Coast was virtually driven to extinction. And American traders, frankly, was running out of tradable goods except for silver. The Brits found the same problem. What they had to offer, the Chinese weren't interested. They were only interested in silver, until the Brits found that if they grew opium in India, that could replace all the hard currency and all the other goods they needed to trade with China. And thus they introduced opium to China. Obviously, the American traders would like to do the same, but they have no access to the opium in India. So instead, they found the opium from Turkey and used that to trade with China. In fact, one of the wealthiest American family that made their money trading opium to China was the Delano family. And the Delano was, I think, if I remember correctly, the grandfather for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So one of the things to keep in mind, nowadays we talk about war on drugs. Actually, the international addiction to opium and to drugs was started by the British, motivated by the China trade. The First Opium War in 1840 exposed, and it took about a couple of years up and down the coast of China, exposed the weakness of the Manchu government, the fact that they are at that point indeed a paper tiger. And so the Unequal Treaty the British forced on the Manchu court was the first of the unequal treaties that was foisted on China. The US didn't want to be left behind, and they sent Caleb Cushing to China to try to negotiate the same deal. And actually, the Manchu government was very willing to give the most favored most favored nation to the US, hoping that the US in rivalry with UK would be the counterbalance to keep the Great Britain from dominating the whole situation. At that point, the population of America has quadrupled. So now instead of 100 to 1, the relative population is about 25 to 1. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Anson Burlingame was a very interesting person in history of U.S.-China relations. He was an early supporter of Abraham Lincoln. He was a founder, one of the founders of what became the Grand Old Party or the Republican Party. He worked so hard to get Lincoln elected president in 1860 that he neglected his own re-election campaign and actually lost. At that point, he was a congressman from Massachusetts. His stand on abolition is very well known. He respects the value of the human life. He was probably one of the earliest fervent advocate of human rights. Lincoln appointed him ambassador to China, which he promptly accepted in 1861. On the way to China, he actually stopped at Hawaii and made the acquaintance of a young reporter called Sam Clement. And we will come back to that a little bit later. He got to Hong Kong and spent a few months traveling through China just to learn more about the country that he was about to serve as ambassador. And he arrived in Beijing about 1862. This is just a couple of years after the Second Opium War. The Second Opium War, the British and the French were totally ruthless in invading and pillaging Beijing. They ransacked the Yuan. Now, some of you that visit Beijing knows how grand Summer Palace is. Well, imagine a set of gardens that was 6 or 7 times bigger and grander than the Summer Palace, and that was Yuan. And as is the habit of the British, whatever they couldn't pillage and take home, they tear down and burned as a threat to the local population, as a way of, quote unquote, to drive the lesson home. And this is why some of the most valuable artistic pieces and carvings and goods from that era from Beijing are now scattered all over the world. And in fact, some of the wealthy Chinese millionaires and billionaires, they have been trying to collect and buy back some of the things that belong to China. Well, this is the time when Burlingame arrived to Beijing, and he saw how the Western diplomatic corps were really there to try to carve up China, to take on more unequal treaties, to take on possessions on ports and harbors in China. And he rejected all those concepts. He promoted the idea that all countries' sovereignty should be respected, and that the Chinese culture is worthy of respect. In fact, he rejected the idea of extraterritorial powers for the Western countries. One of the Americans was arrested for murder in China, and he, among the only Western nation, accepted testimonies of the Chinese, and in fact, sentenced the American to be executed for murder. That was just show how fair-minded he was. I think the history footnote will show that that particular person actually somehow escaped and got away. As part of his actions while he was ambassador, he promoted trade and technology between the two countries. And of course, at that time, technology transfer is probably more apt to be from China than to the US. I think I will also plan on talking more about that at the next week's webinar. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting, unique history about Anson Burlingame was that when his term was up and he was ready to return to the United States in 1867, the regent at that time, Prince Gong, or in Chinese we call him Gong Qingwang, actually went to see Burlingame and said, Mr. Burlingame, we are about to send a team to the Western countries in order to try to rectify the various unequal treaties that has been foisted on us. We need somebody with the stature, but also with the know-how and experience in how to negotiate with Western countries. Would you consider being appointed our ambassador to the West? Burlingame accepted the invitation immediately and promptly wrote a letter back to Secretary of State Seward saying, hey, I'm resigning as ambassador to China. And by the way, I'm coming back as the ambassador from China. This is in history the only round trip ambassador that I know of. He landed in San Francisco. He was treated to a lot of celebration. He went to Boston and he was party there, and he then ended up in Washington and negotiated what became the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. This treaty, first of all, as you can see there, it says mutually the US and China recognize each other on a most favored nation status. They agree to mutually non-interfere with the internal affairs of the other country, and that the citizens of both countries have the right to immigrate and live in the other country. As this treaty was very unusual because it's the only one in the West that treated China as an equal, as a peer. And this is very important for two reasons. A somewhat intangible reason is that it establishes footing that US treats China fairly. It left that impression in the people in China. And that impression persisted for quite some time. The second thing that is more consequential is that it started this Chinese education mission. It encouraged the actual happening of what is known as the Chinese education mission. And for the next slide, I'd like to go into that a little bit. During this period that Burlingame was ambassador, or even before, there was a remarkable young man called Yong Wing. In Mandarin, I think it's called Rong Hong. He was adopted by or sponsored by some American missionaries in the Guangzhou area, and took him as a young boy to the United States. And he thus was educated in Connecticut, I believe, and went to Yale. And his one of the more famous contribution at Yale was at the annual football scrimmage between the sophomores and freshmen. He was watching as a freshman and caught on quickly. At one point, took the ball and ran to the goal and scored one for the freshman class. When he went back to China, one of the senior officials in the Manchu court was Li Hongzhang, who then recognized and appreciate the bicultural, bilingual background of Yong Wing, sent him to America to buy some turnkey manufacturing plants in order to upgrade the technology and the know-how in China. Specifically, I think he bought some plants to make weapons for China. Thus, he gained the trust and confidence of Li Hongzhang. After the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, he promoted the idea that China should send more young boys to America for education. And Li Hongzhang was talked into it, and they decided to send a group of 30 young boys around age 12 plus or minus every year for 4 years, thus send 120 boys to China, to the US for education. The first batch came to the US in 1872. And in fact, they were among the first ones to ride the Transcon Railroad all the way to New England. Because of Jung's connection there, many of the Christian families in Connecticut hosted these boys and sent them to New England schools. So every year, 30 of them came, but not all was well, in the sense that the boys, the Manchu government in China was very concerned and worried about how these young boys will fare in the strange countries. So they were constantly worried about them, and they were concerned. And then they found out that maybe the boys are becoming too Americanized. So they stopped the program in 1881. And most of the boys did not finish their college education. They were not in the US long enough to complete. Nevertheless, because of their education and training, when they went back to China, they became some very important contributors, not only to US-China relations, but also to introducing Western know-how to the Chinese. Some of them, for example, Tang Shaoyi and Cai Tinggan, they become prominent officials during the Yuan Shikai government. Liang Chen, the first one, became an ambassador to China, to Washington. He was also a terrific baseball pitcher. He won. He won the game for his prep school against a rival, and most importantly, when he was in Washington, he struck a friendship with the President Theodore Roosevelt, and thus he convinced Theodore Roosevelt to repatriate the indemnity fund that China paid to the US and convinced him to use that to found Tsinghua University, and also to found scholarship for Chinese students to come to the US for further education. And this turned out to be a very important contribution, not the least including my father-in-law. He was a prep school student at Tsinghua, and he came full board, paid to go to MIT for bachelor's, master's at Penn, and PhD at Harvard. And he was just one of many that took advantage of this provision. Zhang Tianyu was one of the two graduates that did graduate, and he became the father of China's railroad. He built some of the first railroad in China. And these are some of the example of the positive contributions as a consequence of the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. Of course, the Exclusion Act of 1882 and the racism that came and the cruel treatment of the Chinese erased all the positive benefits, but that's a different story. And I'm not going to spend any time covering that, but that sets the chapter between the bright light of Burlingame and the subsequent dark pages of the U.S. China history. And the dark pages, I probably will comment on that again next week. But let's go to the last slide, please. To conclude as to what happened to Anson Burlingame, after the successful Treaty of 1868, Burlingame took his party to England and met with Queen Victoria. He went on to France to meet the Napoleon III, Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, and Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg. Because of his stature and reputation, all the leaders of these countries met him, welcomed him politely, but basically gave him the runaround because they were not in the least interested in striking a treaty similar to the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. He didn't give up, and he ended up in St. Petersburg meeting with Tsar in February of 1870, where he contracted pneumonia and died in 4 days. He was just a few days short of his 50th birthday when he died. The Chinese delegation led by Zigang and Sun Jiagu, they went on, and having learned from the experience, they visited 11 countries over a 2 year and 8 months period. And that's really the first venture of the Manchu Court at international diplomacy. Burlingame's remains was buried in the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Mass. The Manchu Court posthumously appointed him, Anson Burlingame, a first-rank court official in a Manchu court. And that's saying something, because usually you have to be a relative of the imperial family to be at the first-rank official. And of course, they also compensated his family with silver and with silk. Now, San Clement, who later, because of his acquaintance with Burlingame, there's a story about it, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll skip the story. But Mark Twain became a lifelong fan of Anson Burlingame. And the eulogy he wrote, a rather long one, basically acknowledged that Burlingame was a great man and a public servant of the world. And that's the marks of Burlingame. And now we can go to the third slide. So when I was, I think I read about Burlingame maybe 14, 15 years ago at a local newspaper, a local Burlingame paper. There's a historical society there, and they wrote about Burlingame. And what a remarkable story. So I started to read up about him. In fact, I was invited to Suffolk University in Boston. I gave a talk about, and I said, you know, we need more people like Burlingame to promote positive relations. And somebody walked up to me and said, did you know that there's a professor actually writing a life about Burlingame? So I've been following Burlingame, and then by coincidence, my friend David Tsai and I got together and we had a cup of coffee, and to my amazement, he knew about Burlingame, and quite separately, his son lives in Burlingame. And told him about it, and he remarked on the remarkable life and reacted the same way I did. And the two of us then contacted a mutual friend of ours, none other than our moderator, Don Tao. And Don was very enthusiastic and impressed about Life of Burning Game, as he can tell you. Not only that, he wrote a piece, which is the third bullet about why U.S. China needs more burning game in the Chinese version. Now, what David and I did, we start the scheme on how we can honor the man burning game and at the same time promote the positive message of burning game. And David knew the mayor of Burlingame, city of Burlingame, Michael Brunwick. So we met with him and we struck a scheme, which was that on the 150th anniversary of the Burlingame Treaty, we would have a party and we honor him in the Burlingame City Library. By chance, about 3 years earlier, a Chinese sculptor and artist visited me because he was interested in the railroad, what the Chinese did in building the railroad. I told him about Burning Game, and he was so interested, he took it on his own to study the various photographs of Burning Game and created a bronze bust of Burning Game. And when he heard about our plans to celebrate his memory, he donated the bust. And that was perfect because today, if you come and visit Burning Game and go to the city library, in the basement of the library, there is a place for his bust and some materials about Burning Game and the flags that Burning Game used for China and for the US. And that is written up on my blog, the georgekoo.com blog. There I recorded all the local reports and pictures and invitation about that particular celebration. And the very last URL you see there is one created by the Burning Game Library. They too have a collection of various articles about Anson Burning Game. So the idea and the purpose of my presentation today is to, first of all, pay my accolades to a gentleman like Anson Burning Game. What a role model he is for all of us. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing. Walter Christman and I created the Burning Game Foundation. I almost forgot to talk about that. With the same motivation, which is how do we promote Burning Game? And Walter is going around the country now, going around the world, I should say, in Geneva, in the Middle East, talking about the Burning Game principle for the 21st century. And so he is trying to promote the idea that we should be all emulate the ideals and principles of Anson Burning Game. Unfortunately, it's sad to report that the world event seems to be going the other way at this point. And I look forward to talking more about that next week. But at this point, Don, I bet you're ready for Q&A, right?
Okay, almost. Before we go to Q&A, first of all, if you have questions for George, please enter your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, okay? First of all, I want to thank George for giving us this recollection of U.S.-China relationship in the 19th century, especially about that period involving Anson Burning Game, which is really a period of fresh air as far as U.S.-China relationship is concerned. And it actually can shed some light on what are the possibilities of U.S.-China relationship in the 21st century, because it happened 150 years ago. So 150 years ago, U.S.-China relationship was based on unequal treaties until Burlingame Treaty. Then it became an equality of nations following the equality of people in the United States. So that can really shed some light on what we can do in the 21st century, treating each other on an equal basis, equality of nations. Okay, now I would like to open the floor for question time. So George, is a question for you from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah.
why were the Europeans not interested in Burlingame? And what he had to say about China? Was it racism? So that's the question.
Okay, could you repeat? Oh, not interested in Burlingame. Well,
Why were the Europeans not interested in Burlingame? And what he had to say about China? Was it racism?
well,
I let
yeah.
you answer, but I can also answer too. But you answer
well,
first.
let me answer first, and then you go next. Whatever
Okay.
I miss out, you come in, Don.
Okay.
The Europeans did not have lack of interest in Burlingame. They were simply not interested in striking the same deal with China that Burlingame was representing. Don't forget, he was the ambassador from China, and the Europeans have no interest in recognizing China as an equal peer nation, and that is why. Is it racism? Well, maybe that's part of it, but much more important, China was a rich, ripe plum to be picked.
Yes, very good. Actually, that was also my answer in the sense that Britain was not interested in a treaty like the Burlingame Treaty because they didn't want to go that far. So it's not that they weren't interested in China relationship; they just weren't interested in the Burlingame Treaty.
Right.
Okay.
I would like to answer this question about whether my father was from a well-to-do family.
Okay.
Can I answer that quickly?
Sure.
He was able to go to college because Xiamen University, my father-in-law was the one that came to the U.S. for education, and he was from a dirt poor peasant family in Shanxi province. My father was not from a well-to-do family, and the only reason he was able to attend college was because Xiamen University was funded by Chen Jiagen, or what they call Tan Ka-gi, who made his money in Singapore and created a university that was tuition-free for anybody that was qualified to attend. And then my father was able to come to the U.S. for further education because the government used the indemnity, the World War II indemnity from Japan to send some students to the U.S.
Okay. Next question. What initiated the decline in relations between the United States and China? Was it simply issue of animosity toward Chinese immigrants, or was there some specific events that caused a decline?
Okay. Well, if we're talking about the decline of the U.S.-China relations since Nixon went to China, that decline I will talk about next week in great detail. That if you're referring to the decline after the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, the Exclusion Act of 1882, that had to do with racism for sure, but it also had to do with economics. The economy in China, in the US, hit a rough skid, and there was unemployment. And when you are unemployed, you look with envy at the Chinese that were willing to do the work that no others was willing to take. They were doing laundry, they were, mining, they were doing fishing. There's even a plaque in North Bay here in San Francisco. They were harvesting shrimp, tiny shrimp, and drying it and sending it back to China. The Americans here wouldn't touch that shrimp. It's not considered edible. And yet, because they saw the Chinese making money on it, they passed a statute saying shrimping in the North Bay is forbidden. So it's bias, it's jealous, economic jealousy, and it's racism. It's all of the above.
Okay, let me add another thing to that, and that is, you got to remember what happened in the 1860s and 70s. Remember, the Burlingame Treaty is based on the equality of nation. That is modeled when Lincoln freed the slaves. So that's based on the model United States of equality of people. And you got to remember what happened after Lincoln was assassinated. Then the whole movement to free the slaves, the whole Reconstruction movement was actually set back by 100 years. In other words, the United States, the freeing of the slaves actually did not really occur until around 1960s when the civil rights movement really took place. So there was a setback for a long time within the United States on the whole Reconstruction movement. And so that of course will lead to no interest in equality of the nation, because the United States was also not interested in the equality of people. So the equality of the nation, they would not be interested. So there was another reason why it was set back in the 1870s, and then it was replaced by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay.
There's a
yes.
Don, there's a question by Gerald Belsky that's very interesting.
Yes. Why don't you?
You want to read it out loud? Because
okay. Are you aware that Burlingame was part of a group around Lincoln when his economic advisor Henry Carey, who promoted the economic development of the world through credit for railroads and infrastructure and technology transfer, called the American system versus the British system of empire. Sun Yat-sen was also a follower of the American system as indicated by the 3 principles of the people. So that's the question from Gerald Bells.
I find this question fascinating, and I'll admit I'm not a student of Henry Carey, and I'm not sure I understood the American system versus the British system. I think I do think railroad infrastructure technology have been playing a very important role in the development of America. In fact, the Transcon Railroad, and I forgot to mention that in my presentation, the promoter of Transcon Railroad was also driven by the fact that if you have a railroad from the east to the west to the harbor of San Francisco, that's going to facilitate trade between US and China. It was still driven by the motivation to do business with China. As for infrastructure and technology transfer, I didn't know about the American system then, but I will have more to say about it in the current context at the next week's webinar. As far as Sun Yat-sen as a follower, I didn't think of Sun Yat-sen as having a strong economic background, but he certainly formulated his 3 principles of the people because of his admiration for the American system and the American style of democracy. You got anything to add to that, Don?
No, but I do want to bring up another question, which is asked by the audience. This is more of a personal question for you, George.
Yeah.
What got you interested in Chinese history?
I have always been interested in history, particularly Chinese history, but I'm also read up on, Japanese history, European history. I have to admit, I'm less of a student of American history because I have a bias. A couple of 100 years of history to me is not that interesting when there are thousands of years of history to study. History teaches you how nations are formed, how groups become civilized, and so on and so forth. It's just a fascinating story about humankind. And, if you don't know history, to quote that famous Santayana said, those who don't remember their history are doomed to repeat it. And hopefully we're not doomed to repeat it today.
Okay. George, I want to ask you one question. You mentioned about the Burlingame Foundation, and you mentioned a little bit about it. Can you say something? What are the plans for the Burlingame Foundation as far as you can see in the foreseeable future, like in the next 2-3 years? What are the plans?
Yeah, the purpose of the Burlingame Foundation, as I said, was to promote the principles that Burlingame stood for. And one way to promote it, actually, and that brings up your role on this, Don. One way to promote it is to actually do either a movie or documentary on his life. And thanks to you, Don, you've actually wrote a screenplay, but if you don't mind my saying so, that's putting the cart before the horse, because until we get somebody willing to write the check to have that story going on, make it happen, the screenplay is just going to lie there and wait. And from the back of my envelope calculation, I think we could do a documentary on Burlingame with a budget of maybe $1 million, and maybe with inflation, maybe $2 million. Now, to do a fictional story of Burlingame, that would take more. And that would be, I don't know, I don't have that creativity to imagine what that fictional story could look like. But that's really an idea that I want to continue to promote, is let's get the story of Burlingame out to the world audience.
Yes, actually, I agree with you. Actually, the screenplay does not necessarily have to be a movie. It could also serve as a screenplay for a documentary. As a matter of fact, we have people who are interested and are looking into it, making a documentary. As a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I just discussed with the person who donated the bus to Burlingame.
Yeah,
he said,
Liming.
Yeah,
Zhu Liming.
Yeah, he was in actually southern China, talking to a publisher. They're thinking of publishing a book first on the Burlingame, and then of course he himself is also interested in both a documentary and a movie.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's in the work, but it's not so easy. And actually, a couple of years ago, I actually found someone who's interested in making a documentary and mentioning about the price similar to what you mentioned about $1 million. But of course, you're talking about movie, it's going to be 10 times, if significantly more than that. You're talking about at least 10 times more than $1 million, depending on what kind of movie you want to make. But right now, because the largest movie market in the world is actually China and the United States. So there are a lot of movies being made jointly by US companies and Chinese companies. So I think there could be a market for it. And
this could be the perfect timing for it, Don. We were premature and we were early when we started talking about it 5-10 years ago. But today, this could very well be a highly saleable and attractive product to bring up on a silver screen.
Yeah, it could be perfect timing, or it could be just the opposite of perfect timing, because right now people are all so negatives against China. So it could go one.
At least it will sell in China, I think, right?
Yes. Okay. Are there any additional questions? But I think we exhausted all the questions, I believe. It's almost time. I do have some announcements that I want to make. So, George, thank you very much. I'm going to show you a couple ending slides, because I do have an important announcement to make, in the sense that we are making one change. Can you see? I'm showing the upcoming webinars. There are only 2 remaining webinars. One is next week on November 10th. It's also on U.S.-China relationship, but now we talk about the 20th and the 21st centuries. So George will be the speaker again, and he's going to talk about not only the 20th, 21st century, but in particular, he'll talk about the U.S. policy toward China of the last 3 presidents. Okay, and then the last webinar is on November 17th, and the topic is China is not U.S. enemy. Besides Sheila Zhao, we also added a new speaker. That's KJ No, who's a Korean by birth. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializes in geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. So the last webinar on November 17th will be a joint presentation by Sheila Zhao as well as KJ No. And I also want to mention that the replays of the webinars up to the last one, which is last week, has already been posted in the Coalition Peace Initiative website. And that website, I believe, is already shared in the chat box tonight. And it was sent out to all the registrants. There are about close to 300 people who are registered for the webinar series. And that was just sent out early this morning. So if you are registered, since all of you should have registered, you should have received that already, okay? Okay, thank you very much. George, do you want any parting remarks? Because we are running towards.
It's been a pleasure, Don, and thank you for doing this. I look forward to talking to everybody next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much. And thank you for attending, and we see you next week, okay? Bye.